this is now our fifth message in a series we call the Theology of Creation. Over the last number of weeks, we have heard things about the creation of the world and the creation of people. Last week, we heard a detailed message about the evidence for creation from a guest speaker, from Dr. Hal Walters. And this is important. Listen, we have had on a number of occasions things where we have heard, whether it was at a special creation seminar we did on a Saturday or something like last Sunday, where we've heard a lot of very, very detailed scientific evidence for creation. Today we're going to look at something a little different, and it is going to be some of the evidence that shows weaknesses in the prevailing theories of evolution. And I think that's going to be something that's going to be important for us to hear about, important for Christians and important for non-Christians. Why is this important? Well, for Christians it's important because especially young people are going to find themselves in institutions, perhaps colleges, where they will be taught things concerning evolution, and it's going to be important for them as they are being pressured to conform to that institutional idea to be able to know that Christian faith, faith in a creator, is a rational faith, and in fact, as I see it, more rational than a faith in evolution. That's important to me as a pastor to be able to proclaim this to Christians. It's also important for non-Christians because getting a right picture of our origins gives us a right picture of our relationship with God. The Apostle Paul shows us that here in Acts chapter 17, where you're turned right now. He came to a city called Athens. Athens was an important intellectual center, and people spent much of their time debating intellectual ideas. The Apostle Paul began doing some teaching there, and he was invited to appear at a place called the Areopagus, or Mars Hill. It was a place where they said, let's have something of a debate about what truth is. And you might think, well, Paul could start almost anywhere on the subject matter of what truth is. And what he chose to do was to start with ideas about creation. Here in verse 24, for example, Paul, speaking to a group of intellectuals, says, "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands." Let's understand these. He says there is a Lord who made everything around us, and there are false ideas about who He is. There's false ideas about how to come to know Him, and we don't want to be involved in that. We need to know Him as a right creator. He's not served by human hands, verse 25, as if He needed anything, because He Himself gave life to all men and breath to everything else. From one man, verse 26, He made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And He determined the times for them and the exact places where they should live. He says, I want you to understand this. It's our Creator God who made all people. And it's our Creator God who has done all of this work so that you may come to know Him because you know Him as Creator. Note this, verse 27. God did this so that men would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He's not far from each one of us. For in Him we move, we live and move and have our being, as some of your own poets have said. We are His offspring. Do you notice what's going on here? The Apostle Paul says, when I am trying to communicate something about God, I am going to go all the way back and start with ideas about origins and say some of these things that are false ideas are going to turn you away from God in the wrong way. You're not going to believe that. I'm going to tell you true things about this so that you can come to know God. Some of the false ideas they had in their generation had to do with many gods and temples that were made by man and so forth. The false ideas we have about origins in our generation tends to be linked to things about evolution. And so we're going to be discussing that here today. We're going to hear something about micro and macroevolution, some basic presuppositions, things about origins of life, things about design or chance. And I'm going to suggest you may want to hold on to your Bible and to the same chapter. At the end of our message, we're going to come back and see how the Apostle Paul ends some of these matters. But in the meantime, things about evolution. We'll think first of all about the rise of Darwinian evolution. Thinking of someone named Charles Darwin, who in the 1830s set sail aboard the HMS Beagle. He was an unpaid naturalist and he took this sea voyage, and as he went, he had already rejected the Bible as truth. He was looking for something that would validate his rejection of God as creator. So he got to the Galapagos Islands, and when there, he noted that there were finches that were there. Finches are little birds, and some of them had beaks that were longer, and some had beaks that were shorter. He began to note that it seemed that those beaks that were longer or shorter correlated with differences in the environments of some. They eat this here, and they eat this there, and they needed beaks that were a little longer and shorter, and so on. And from that, he began to develop an idea about natural selection, how sometimes things can change a little bit to be more fitted to their environment. And from that, he created a new idea that this not only explained the differences between one animal and another that were similar, but just narrow differences, but also he said this would explain how ultimately all creatures developed. Maybe they started from a few cells and became simple creatures, and then those creatures evolved into more complex creatures, and those creatures evolved into still more complex creatures, and eventually one creature turned into another, all the way up to the point where we would have people developed out of animals this way. The whole thing was published in 1859, a book called The Origin of Species. There were many who hailed this as truth on philosophical grounds. Understand this, listen now. He had acknowledged himself that the scientific evidence of it was something he expected would be found later. He said, in the fossil record, we should find this kind of evidence. In these things, we should find the evidence. I don't have that evidence now, but philosophically, I believe this must be true. Many people said, this was really good. They wanted something that would discount the idea of God as creator and have a new theory about how man came about, and this seemed like a good thing for them, and they accepted this. There's a problem in all of this, and that's the problem of what we will call microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution, meaning that things change within their own species. There are small changes, micro changes, is something that everyone more or less agrees on. We can see that there were differences between some finches and other finches. We can see that there are cats, some of them that are rather tame and small, and some of them that get rather big and wild. We see differences within a species. In fact, we can make some of that happen. You think of people who breed dogs, and they will breed dogs, and some of them become bigger, and some of them become smaller, and some of them have very acute smell, and they're able to track things and so on. You say, yeah, we can get differences within a species. There can be microevolution. This is something that's rather well known. It isn't a surprise to anyone. Then we have macroevolution. This is the idea that one species can change into another. Fish can begin to grow legs, and they can come up on land, and their gills can change into lungs, and they can become land animals. This is the idea of macroevolution. Macroevolution would say that other animals in time began to have little things that projected, became wings, and they became birds and began to fly. This is the idea of macroevolution. This is the idea that eventually some creatures began to stand upright, and by and by they became people. This is macroevolution. This is something that has a basic problem, and that is that there's no evidence that that ever happened. By breeding on purpose, if we tried very, very hard and said, let's see if we can get some fish and cause them to grow legs and walk on land, we've never been able to have anything like that happen on purpose. There's no evidence that we can do that if we try. What is more, there's no evidence that this ever did happen in the past based on fossil records. Are you with me on this so far? Darwin himself had said, I am sure that we'll find in the fossil record something where there were these kind of creatures, and then slowly they transitioned over the course of a long time into these kinds of creatures. We'll find this, we'll dig this up, and it'll be there. About 30 years ago, at a significant conference on paleontology, that is, digging up fossils and so forth, the paleontologists announced to all the other branches of science at a conference which was called Macroevolution, that was the name of the conference. They announced, we have now for over 100 years been trying to dig up fossils looking for evidence of something that is in between, where something is part fish but is becoming an animal. And so if it happened slowly, it should have happened that there would be in the fossil record, things that were part this and part this and part this and part this, and then they would slowly transition to the next. And that was what the theory was. That was what Darwinian evolution said it would prove. They said we've looked for those in-between stages. We've looked for over 100 years, and in fact, we haven't found that. And the more we look, the more we see that things stay within their set groupings, and we're not likely to ever find that. And we are giving up on the idea of traditional Darwinian evolution. It's over, say the paleontologists. That was a surprise to some others who are still holding on to this idea, and they began to have to come up with new ideas for how to hold on to Darwinian evolution, because the normal way of thinking about it isn't what is being held on to any longer. There's no longer this sense that one thing has slowly become something else. I should tell you, and this is important, everyone needs to hear this. If you go to a high school class, if you go to some college classes, but mostly at the high school level, Darwinian evolution of the old sort is still taught. And it's still taught using the evidence of microevolution. They will say, these things developed where simple things became more and more complex things, and everything developed from more primitive creatures. And the way we know this is because of Darwin's finches and because of other things. There are changes between things within the species, and so that's the evidence we have that this happens. Did everyone catch what we're doing? It's a switcheroo. They say the way that we know that macroevolution is true is because we know that microevolution does happen. It's using something that everyone agrees on to try to prove something that has no evidence for. And this happens again and again. There have been some states that have said, well, we'd like to have in our textbooks something where there are at least discussions of the possibility of something other than evolution, and this is firmly opposed by some in the teaching fields, and they'll bring this to court, and they'll present to the judge and say, well, we know that there is evolution, why look at this, and pull out all the microevolution that they could find, the judge said, yeah, that's science. And so he'll rule that only macroevolution can be taught in schools based on the evidence of microevolution. You all understand where we're going with this thing? It is a switcheroo, taking the evidence for one thing and saying that proves something different. It's useful for you whenever you're hearing about evidences for macroevolution, for big evolution, to look and see what the evidence is, and it is virtually always evidences that are for small things, microevolution. As a result, the people who are deeper into evolutionary thinking have largely rejected the traditional Darwinian evolution, though it's still what's taught in the schools in high school and other things. They've said, no, this isn't really what is truth. We're going to have to come up with something different. Roughly the same time that those paleontologists were making this announcement some 30 years ago, there was a British evolutionist, a paleontologist named Colin Peterson, who decided that he would go to a number of these key conferences and ask all his Darwinian friends what was even one thing they knew for sure about evolution. Because there's so much of it within the context of what the experts know, they know that they don't know. And so he thought he'd ask them what's at least one thing they knew for sure. And so he tells a little bit about this. Mr. Patterson says that he went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and he was lecturing to biologists there, and he tried this question on them. He said, what is one thing that we really know about evolution? And what he got was silence. There was no answer for it. He went to the evolutionary morphology seminar at the University of Chicago and tried that same question again. And there was a long silence, and eventually one person said, I do know one thing. It ought not to be taught in high school. The theory of evolution as taught at the high school level is already known to be fraudulent, but is carried on largely because there is an underlying belief that it must be something like this, even though we don't know yet what all the answers are. We don't have the evidence for it, but this is what we believe. This man, Dr. Patterson says that modern science assumes there's a rationalist view of nature, that is evolution, that is replaced an irrational one, which is creation. Creation is irrational, evolution is rational. That's what modern science has been teaching. And he said that at this time in his life, he woke up and realized that all my life I've been duped into taking evolutionism as revealed truth in some way. He experienced a shift from what he called evolution as knowledge to evolution as faith. He still believes in evolution, but he realized it's based on faith, not based on scientific fact, because the evidence is not there. You may ask me, how does the evolutionist explain this lack of fossil evidence? If there isn't any evidence for it all having happened, how does he explain this? I will tell you now. The paleontologists and others who decided that they would stick with the idea of evolution, but there's no evidence for it, said, no, it's true. We don't see any things in the fossil record where one thing changes to the next. So what we think happened, this is the new theory, what we think happened is that things carried along very stable for a long time, and then at some moment, things suddenly, in one generation, almost overnight, would change so that an animal would grow wings and fly and grow birds, and it happened so fast that there isn't any fossil record. And they have a name for what they call this. There's a fancy name for this. It's called punctuated equilibrium, meaning that there had been an equilibrium, a balance of everything, and then every once in a while there's a punctuated moment where something big happens. Is there any evidence for that theory? The answer is no, there's not. It's a philosophical idea rather than something that there's any evidence for, but they would want to hold on to this as probably a new idea for how evolution happened, because it must have happened. It must have happened. I think what I need to say to you about this is that the evolutionist will hold on to such a theory mainly because of some underlying belief system, some preconception that he has, even if it's not supported by the evidence. And so that causes us to move to our second part of the message, which is, what are these basic presuppositions that somebody has who would support an idea like evolution? A presupposition is something you suppose or believe ahead of time. It's a presuppose, a presupposition, and it's what you believe before you make a decision. What underlying belief is at the heart of evolutionary thinking? And we could say that it's a belief in materialism, that the material world is all there is. There's no God, there's no creator. Everything that you can see in the material realm is all there is. That's a belief system. It's a faith system. This is all there is. Another word for this is the word naturalism. It's a belief system, not a creator. Everything we see must have happened by itself somehow. Materialism and naturalism, those two words are used interchangeably. You can get an idea of the importance of this in their minds by this quote. Julian Huxley says, Darwin's real achievement was to remove the whole idea of God as the creator of organisms from the sphere of rational discussion. The idea being there is rational talk, and that's talk of evolution, and there's irrational talk, and that's the talk of God. One is rational, and the other is irrational. Did you get this? Now, I'm hoping to present to you that the talk of evolution, at least as it's been traditionally portrayed, or even as it's being portrayed now, is increasingly understood to be irrational. But the thought was that we can all know that one is rational and the other is irrational. That's the idea behind naturalism or materialism. So much is this the case that it's thought that even if evolution is wrong, the evolutionist must come up with some explanation that excludes God, even if the evidence points in the opposite direction. Let me give you a couple of ideas or examples of this. I brought a couple of these along with me. Some examples. Our friend Richard Dawkins, who you've heard of, says the following, quote, even if there were no actual evidence in favor of the Darwinian theory, we should be justified in preferring it over all rival theories. say that again, you have to listen to this closely. Even if there were no actual evidence in favor of the Darwinian theory, we should still be justified in preferring it over all rival theories. Darwinian evolution is the thing we're going to hold on to, and we would really be right to prefer it over any other theory, even if there was no evidence for it, because it's materialistic, it's naturalistic, it must be true therefore. Did you get that? It doesn't matter if there's any scientific facts behind it, we still have to believe it. Here's the same argument flipped in the other direction. This is something printed in Nature journal, saying, quote, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. Even if all the evidence pointed to something where there was an intelligent designer, we can't accept any of that because having a designer is not naturalistic. We get the same kind of material in typical high school textbooks, quoting from a couple of them here. One of them says this, quote, many people believe that a supernatural force or deity created life. That explanation is not within the scope of science. What it's not saying is we've discredited that. We can prove that that's not true. What they're saying is you can't rationally think along these lines because science doesn't permit someone to acknowledge the existence of God. Another quote. By attributing the diversity of life to natural causes rather than to supernatural creation, Darwin gave biology a sound scientific basis. Now sound science is one that is linked to philosophical naturalism and materialism. If you believe that, you can do sound science. If you don't believe that, if you believe that there is a God, you cannot do sound science. That's the message here. I remember seeing a similar kind of a message. I was at the Chicago Museum of Natural History, the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. It's on the south side of Chicago, the Museum of Science and Industry. There's a lot of interesting things there, including a wonderful model railroad display, which is cool. But in one area of the museum, there's a big display there, at least there was when I was there, and effectively it told us this. It said, let's help to distinguish between what is really scientific fact and what is not. And they let us know that wherever there were references to Bible stories of creation, that this was mythology and was not scientific fact. But where there was evolution, this was factual and scientific and was to be believed. And so that we would want to be able to distinguish between the two, and they had a big chart that showed us all about this, so that I, as a museum goer, would be able to understand that one thing involving God, anything related to God, was mythology, and anything regarding evolution was scientific method, it was fact. This is the way this is being portrayed. And these values must be upheld at all costs, even if there isn't any evidence at all. I remember being somewhat impressed as a student looking at textbooks at a couple of different things. One of them was things where there would be maybe a couple of different displays in the book. There would be a set of pictures where it would show maybe little animals that would get to be bigger and bigger and bigger, and it would show that they had evolved in this way. There was a little sort of a dog-looking animal, and then it became something that was sort of a pony-looking animal, and then it became something sort of a horse-looking animal. It would be something that would be a little along these lines. And the dog-looking animal on the far left is what they said, well, we think that this is where it started, and it becomes these other things. You should know that when they show you something like this, there may be fossil record of a little dog-like animal, and there may be fossil records of one or more of the intermediate sort of things, but there's no evidence of anything changing from the one to the other. Do you understand this? The little dog-like animal didn't ever, by fossil record, become something else, become something else, become something else. The whole thing is being put forward as an artist's drawing rather than facts. You see this also frequently with something that looks like a primate, and then it sort of straightens up and becomes a man. And again, there isn't a fossil record of this. It's something that is an artist's conception. Sometimes it becomes even more obvious that something is a hoax. I was also somewhat impressed in the textbooks that I read in those days when we would see pictures of something called a peppered moth. Some of you may remember this from your textbooks. It was said ordinarily the change happens very slowly for millions of years, and so we don't have an ability to really represent this, but we've got a great example of how this can happen fairly quickly. An example was that in industrial England, when things got sloggy and things got really kind of blackened all over the place, that some trees that had been previously light colored became dark colored. And there were little moths, pepper moths, some of them were light, some of them were dark, and the light colored ones sitting on those trees, on those tree trunks, were more vulnerable to birds that eat them. And so this was thought to be evidence of how things would change rather rapidly, that there would be fewer and fewer of those because they were eaten up by the birds. And we saw this in just a matter of decades, really, or less, because the conditions in England changed and peppered moths ended up evolving and changing. Are you with me on all this? Some of you remember peppered moths in the textbooks? This was a key thing in all the textbooks because it was the best example they had of something that had changed right before our eyes. The problem with the whole thing, and these are, it's kind of a big problem. The problem with the whole thing is that it was all a hoax. Peppered moths don't sit on tree trunks. They sit up in leaves of the tree. And all the pictures of the peppered moths, they were not only in your textbook, but were part of a movie documentary that had been made and passed around. All of the pictures of these things were something where scientists had taken dead peppered moths and glued them to tree trunks and then taken the pictures of all of this. It wasn't real. The whole thing was a hoax. At first, some people knew it was a hoax and many didn't. It was moved from one textbook to the next. Later, it was revealed to everyone that the thing had been a hoax. The people, in fact, who had been involved in some of the technicians who said, yeah, I was involved in making that movie documentary and I was involved in picture taking. I was there and I helped to glue these things on. Those are dead moths that were there. They don't actually live in that kind of environment. The whole thing was a hoax. Even once that was announced, the peppered moths continue to be in high school textbooks. Why do they continue to be in textbooks? The editors of the textbooks say that even though it isn't really true, it represents truth. Even though it isn't really true evidence, it helps people to understand it visually in a very good way, and that when students get older, beyond high school, they can do it clinically what it really means to be either true or not true, but for right now, this is good evidence, and so they're going to continue to use it. Do you understand what I'm saying? The commitment to philosophical naturalism is so strong that there's a need to perpetuate what they themselves know as a hoax in order to keep convincing others of it. It's that strong. Philip Johnson, a Christian who has written much about this, says Darwinian evolution is grounded not on scientific fact, but on philosophical doctrine called naturalism. You understand this? It's not scientific facts that support all of this. And so what I'm attempting to say to all of you is, rather than saying, well, there's what is rational and factual and scientific and based on observation, and that's evolution. And then there's other things which is sort of mythology and, guesswork based on creation. It actually appears to be more and more the other way around. That so much of what has been evolutionary thinking is based not on scientific fact at all. Not only about things with the development of species, but we'll go a step further than that and talk about the origin of life. The origin of life. I think it was useful what Dr. Walters said to us last week. He said that more than being concerned for how this animal could have evolved into something else or not, which is an important subject, he says what we really want to do is to be thinking about where did life originate from in the first place? How did it begin? And that's an important question for an evolutionist. A commitment to naturalism makes it difficult for the evolutionist to think about the origin of life. Where did the first cells come from? How did life begin? In thinking about this, evolutionists at first thought that what probably happened was that there were some very basic materials on Earth, and that it was sparked into life by a jolt of electricity, probably from lightning. And so in the 50s and 60s, there was a long line of experiments where some basic matter would be put under an electrical charge to see if we could get life started somehow. And after enough of this went on, finally they said, this is going nowhere. It doesn't look like that's how it started. As a result, newer ideas were that perhaps life originated on another planet, maybe another part of the galaxy or solar system, and so that a comet carried life, and the comet crashed into the world, and that's what brought life. Now, there's a couple of problems with this. One is, of course, that really doesn't resolve where life came from. If you say, well, we know where life came from on Earth, it came from another planet. That still doesn't really help us to know where it originated from. And more importantly, there isn't any evidence that a comet brought it here. This is speculation. And so we're no longer talking about science, are we? We're no longer talking about somebody saying, well, we have evidence that this is what happened. Instead, we're getting more and more speculative in order to try to substantiate a theory that isn't based on science. What's interesting to me is that increasingly, the scientific community isn't even talking about it coming by way of comets or things from outer space, but instead, the thought now is that extraterrestrials brought life to Earth. Intelligent life greater than ours purposefully started life on Earth. And you may say, well, no, this is maybe science fiction movies or so on. This is things that Stephen Hawking and other scientists are discussing as realistic possibilities. Why are they doing this when there's no scientific proof of any of it? Why would you say, I think probably it was extraterrestrials that brought life here when there's no scientific evidence? Again, it's because it's still naturalistic. Even space aliens are a better alternative than God. We know that not only does our world have life, but our world is amazingly well constructed to sustain life. And that's another issue. How did our universe become so fine-tuned to be able to sustain life? And again, the evolutionist tries to think about this. I'll mention a few of them. Astronomer Fred Hoyle, who is sometimes quoted in connection to evolutionary thinking, says, and this is a quote, he says, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect is monkeyed with the physics. What does he mean by that? He says, it sort of looks like everything in our physical world, whether you're talking about gravity or atmosphere or whatever, is so finely tuned that it looks like somebody really, really, really important, somebody who was a super intellect, somebody who was a creator, may have done this. But since he's opposed to the idea of a creator, his conclusion, Fred Hoyle's conclusion is that it was an alien mind from another universe that did this. Another scientist by the name of Greenstein says similar things. He says it looks like there's a supernatural agency that must have done it. But on thinking it over, he decided that the reason that things are as they are is because the cosmos felt a need to be observed. The cosmos itself, the world itself felt a need to be observed, and so it created life forms and created people by itself so that it could be observed. And that's what makes the cosmos fulfilled. Another writer, George Wilder, who's a Nobel Prize-winning biologist, said that intelligent life came about because the universe wants to be known. The physicist Freeman Dyson says that many accidents of physics and astronomy have all worked together for our benefit. Well, it almost seems as if the universe must in some way have known that we were coming. Now we're getting into the idea of mystical ideas of how it all came about, not based on science. It's based on a kind of a faith in naturalism, a faith in materialism, a faith in anything other than the possibility of a divine creator. Another popular theory, and you'll run into this one, I'm sure, is that since everything is so fine-tuned in our universe for life, so fine-tuned on our planet for life, and it seems so improbable this could be happening, a favorite theory right now is that it's not as improbable as it seems. While we have this universe and it has this sustaining life that is really wonderful, probably there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of other universes out there. And so what we have is a multiverse. We have lots of universes. And the reason that this is important to think so is that if there were a gajillion universes, then it's possible that one of them might have worked out so well. Do you understand this? There's the odd statistical possibility that one of them would work out really well if you have a gajillion universes. Is there any evidence for there being a gajillion universes? Is there any way that anyone could possibly know if there is a gajillion universes? No, there's not. There's not at all. It would be better, scientists think, to cling to ideas of aliens or multiple universes or something else rather than to consider the idea of a designer or a creator. And that brings us to the last part of our message, design or chance. The question of origins comes down, as I see it, in part to a matter of faith. We can't recreate the beginning of the universe or the beginning of man. You understand that? Scientific observation is something where you take an experiment and you do it over again to see if you can create it. So, in some ways, this is outside of the range of some areas of science. In the same way that proving Abraham Lincoln is outside of the range of some kind of science. You understand, I can't recreate Abraham Lincoln and say, see, he really existed, we've now created him again. That can't happen. Instead, we look at photographic evidence or journals or historical writings or other things to say this is true or not true. In the same way, we can't start the universe over again and say this is how it was done. We can't observe it happening. But we can certainly look at secondary evidence, like fossil records. Increasingly, those records don't support Darwinian evolution. We can look at living animals and people. And the deeper we look, the more we see signs of design rather than chance. Dr. Walters, a surgeon who does so much with editing scientific journals and so on as well, showed us last week something a little like this, where it was just a single cell. And showed us that there were something like 20 different systems that all work together to make a cell grow. And he explained it in some depth to us. And the key thing that he wanted us to understand is that if any one of them wasn't present, the whole thing wouldn't work. And so it's not like a cell would have some of those things that work kind of okay, and then it would develop something else a million years later, and then work a little better, and then work a little better. And the whole thing had to be designed, and they all come together at the same moment, or else it wouldn't work. And the complexity of it is more than we originally understood. Back in Darwin's day, he thought cells, if he knew about them all, weren't very complex. Now, through electron microscopes and things, we understand the deep complexity of the whole thing, and it all works in a very, very, very organized fashion in a way that strongly suggests the idea of someone who has designed it to work that way. If nothing else, we'd understand that it couldn't work at all unless all of it was working all at the same moment. The phrase for this is irreducible complexity. That's a good phrase to know. That would mean that the complexity of this thing, whether it's the cell or something else in the body, is something that wouldn't work until all of it works all at the same moment, which is a great argument for design rather than an argument for something that evolved over a period of time. Today, an increasing number of scientists are admitting that the world in which we live strongly appears to have design and almost certainly couldn't have happened by chance. More and more are admitting to that. Many of them are not Christians. In fact, there's a greater and greater number of scientists who say, I'm not a Christian, I don't believe Christian things, but it looks to me as though there is a design behind all of this. Either they admit to this, that there is design, or some do, or they reject that, saying, yeah, it looks that way. Everybody can see it looks that way, but I'm going to have to reject that in favor of a less reasonable, less plausible theory, including very remote chances, alternative universes, and space aliens. Many, and maybe most, choose the latter because they have a commitment to materialism. It's their faith. It is, we might say, their religion. Back a number of years ago, there was a time when the state of Ohio had something dragged into court, and again, it was all about whether things about an intelligent designer, a creator, could be taught in the public schools there. And there were people who came and testified, some on behalf of those who are understanding what you and I are understanding now, and others who came and said, no, this is this matter of evolution must be true, and so on. One of the backers of creation approached one of the evolutionists. They were both experts at this thing, and Michael Ruse, one of the evolutionists, was approached and told, "You guys don't really play fair," he was told. "You say that what we believe is a matter of faith, and what you believe is a matter of fact. The fact is that what you believe is also a matter of faith, a kind of religion. You don't have facts to back this up. You instead have a belief system, and it's a different belief system from ours, but it must be acknowledged as being such a belief system." The evolutionist thought this over a little bit and ended up announcing some while later that he agreed with that. He ended up saying the following. He said, "Evolution came into being as a kind of secular ideology, an explicit substitute for Christianity. Evolution is a religion. It was true of evolution at the beginning, and it's still true of evolution today. It is a faith, a kind of a religious faith. It's one that says, this is where we came from, this is where we're going, and this is how we're going to live as we go along. Every bit as much as any religion would say, this is where we came from, and this is where we're going, and this is what we believe in the interim as we go along." Darwinian evolution is a belief system. It's a kind of faith. It's a man-made faith based less on evidence than adherence to a belief system. Some, like this man, recognize and accept that. Some will deny that. Just this year, a USA Today editorial called evolution settled science and said, quote, that evolution is not a matter of opinion or something one chooses to believe in or not. In other words, it's already settled. It's an established fact. You can't choose to believe it or not. It's sort of like, I don't know if I'm going to believe in gravity or not. Someone would say, it's going to affect you whether you believe it or not. It's just true. And so, it's still said to this day, in many quarters, this is an established fact. You just have to believe it. But as we've seen, there's not much settled about evolution. Even in the minds of committed evolutionists, many of them know that there's not one thing that they know for sure. What might the Apostle Paul say about all of this? We come back to the conclusion of all of this. We come to Acts chapter 17. And now verse 27. He's already said it's God who created us. God did this, verse 27, so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. God has made himself known and wants the message of him as creator to be known so that people will reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own offspring, some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being, we should not think that God is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In other words, we're not going to be thinking of it as man-made. That's not right. We're going to think of it along the lines of what God says. In the past, verse 30, God overlooked such ignorance. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to all men by raising him from the dead. To summarize, and the screen behind me shows this, God created us and wants us to seek him. Man-made theories, whether they're about God or about our origins or other man-made theories, are offensive to God if they disagree with God. In the past, Paul says, God overlooked such ignorance. Perhaps in your life, you believed things that were man-made theories that weren't the things that were really true. And God, in patience, allowed someone to walk in that path. But God commands people everywhere to repent. That is, to give up on what is not true and repent of that and turn to what is true. God has appointed a judgment day in the future, and that judge is Jesus, who was raised from the dead. One day, all of us will stand before the Lord, and our job is to repent of what is man-made falsehood and to turn toward faith in Jesus Christ and put our faith uniquely in him. How did the people who heard Paul's message respond? The Bible tells us about this. Verse 32, when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered. Some of them, hearing his message, sneered, scoffed, and were derisive about what he had to say. Others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. Some of them thought, this is very interesting, I want to learn more and go deeper into what I learned. A few of them, it says in verse 33, that Paul left the council, few men became followers of Paul and believed. So, some sneered, some wanted to hear more about it, and some believed. In any group of people, including this one, there's the likelihood that on hearing things of this nature, some may sneer and say, I'm going to stick with what the man-made truth is on this. Some will say, I need to learn more about this. And some will believe, will say, I'm going to trust God's word, and I'm going to realize that it is not something that is anti-intellectual. It's not something that is irrational. In fact, as I understand it, God's truth about these things is a great deal more rational than an irrational faith in evolution. Let's end with prayer. Lord, we would pray simply right now that those who do not know you as Savior would come to faith in Jesus Christ and come to eternal life through Jesus our Savior. I would also pray that you would protect the minds and the hearts of those who have faith in you, who will find that under attack in one way or another. Even those who are studying at or working among those places where naturalism and materialism is thought to be truth in opposition to your word. I pray that you would give wisdom and courage all in this room. I'm thinking of those who are in college settings now, or will be in the next years ahead. I'm thinking of those who are in many other kinds of work-related settings where there are challenges along these lines. And finally, I pray that every area of our beliefs, every area of our intellect, every area of our lives would conform to you, your word, and your truth. We ask this in Jesus' holy name.